Welcome to this presentation of Scanlonville, a history, the land and the community. My name is Edward Lee, and I'm a 60-year resident of Scanlonville. And joining me this morning doing the presentation will be Ms. Collier. You can introduce yourself, Ms. Collier.
Yes, I'm Barbara Fordham Collier from Scanlonville. I don't generally tell my age because sometimes I lie. I changed the number. But I'm a long-term resident of Scanlonville, and I'm a direct descendant of some of the people that we'll be talking about. Scanlonville is very dear to me. It was quite dear to my family, and I'm just honored to have an opportunity to assist in defining who we are, who we were, and who we are.
Okay. As you can see, it's called Scanlonville, a history, the land and the community. We're trying to take a little different approach to presenting this history to you because we feel that in order to know the history of a community, you have to know the people. So we're going to introduce some of the people and the effects that they had to live under. And the land's very important in African American culture, so the land will play a big portion of this presentation also. So with that said, we'll get started. Scanlonville had to be a part of the American history, and it was influenced by American history. So these are some of the things that influenced us, but we'll touch on that as we go along in the presentation. Mainly, we're going to concentrate in the period starting at the Civil War until now, which is 1861 until present day. Here you can see some of the ownership of Scanlonville area. Scanlonville was formerly a plantation on the Wando River. Again, we're going to start with John Scanlon, 1868, but immediately before him was Paul Remley. We're showing all of the previous owners because if you want to get further information, we can certainly enlighten you on all the previous owners too. But for today's purpose, there's just not enough time to go into each owner of the Scanlonville area. And this is really the start of Scanlonville. It starts with the Emancipation Proclamation, and it goes into Reconstruction, continuing into the Jim Crow era, then 1968 to 2021, the New America. As I said, just to give you an idea where we're located, if we use the Ravenel Bridge as a reference point, and you're headed north on the Ravenel Bridge, Scanlonville is the area immediately to the left or the north of the Scanlonville. It's comprised of 600 acres that was purchased by Mr. Scanlon in 1868. This aerial photo shows the 1870 map superimposed on a current aerial photo just to show you what Scanlonville looks like or did look like when you consider how it looks today. The importance of history. And this is a quote from James Baldwin. The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it, and in many ways, and in history is present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. I think the second part, the second sentence is really important. And I say that because when the folks in Scanlonville, as you'll come to see, when they talk about Scanlonville, their frame of reference is over 100 years old. So when you talk to any community member or any resident and you talk about what's going on, I think most Mount Pleasant folks would be in referencing 15, 20 years. Most of us, since we're lifetime residents, our parents were lifetime residents, our grandparents were lifetime residents, and we still live on the same property. We're talking 100 years plus. You want to say anything, Paul?
Yeah, and that history goes with us. The African tradition is one that's oral-based, and so the history that is passed to us is passed in terms of stories, visits. The communities are generally also driven by something called kinship network. That means other people may be involved in your decisions, your choices, what you're fed, what you wear. You get a lot of input from your elders and your neighbors and your in-laws. So between having a land-based culture with very few fences and a community/family involvement, it is just interconnected, and that history flows from person to person to person. You don't move away and lose it. It stays with you.
Great, great. And that brings up another point, another thought, since you mentioned fences. In the culture, in many of the African-American communities, a fence exists solely to contain animals. Growing up in Scanlonville, if you saw somebody with a fence, you pretty much could figure out that they had either livestock or had some dogs, had some kind of animal. And it was common to see folks, especially the kids, if they wanted to go anywhere, they would walk not down the street, they would walk right through your yard. And nobody got offended. And what would happen, the interesting story is, if you were going to the store and you left your house, instead of going down the street, you would go through your backyard, through the neighbor's backyard, into the other street where the store is. You were obligated to pay respect to the neighbors, good morning, good afternoon, and you might get fed.
Yes.
So that was pretty common.
A perfect stranger would see a kid, 10, 11, and you're walking and you don't pay respects, as Ed said, which means you don't speak. Speak means say good morning, say good evening, good afternoon, whatever. And if you did that, your parents would be told. As a part of the kinship network, the social graces were reinforced by one another. You've heard about it takes a village. This is what people are talking about when they say it takes a village.
Yeah. Okay, we move on to the Emancipation Proclamation. A lot of folks, I think that the Emancipation Proclamation was a law, but it actually was an executive order issued by President Lincoln. The first applied in January of 1863, and it affected 10 states in the rebellion in the Union military. It also stifled European intervention on behalf of the Confederates. It changed legal status of 3.5 million enslaved persons, 300,000 exceptions, Texas, Tennessee, and New Orleans. Many of the freed slaves fled to the Union Army-controlled states, and that was a stronghold. Daily until 3.9 million left the South by 1865.
When we say daily, a lot of people think in January 1st, 1863, they opened the floodgates, and 2 million people stepped over the line from enslaved to free. A lot of those people were freed on a daily basis, 700 today, 1,200 tomorrow. It started, but it didn't finish up until 1865.
Right, correct. Now we move on to John Scanlon. Okay, John Scanlon, the Remley's plantation got into some financial trouble back in the late 1800s, 1860s. And what happened is the plantation was put up for auction. Mr. Scanlon, along with 100 other freed slaves, pooled their resources, pooled their money, and they actually bid on the plantation and won the bid. So what they obtained was 600 plus acres, of which they formed the Charleston Land Company, would be the holding company for the 600 acres. The purpose of the Charleston Land Company was to look out for the welfare of other freed slaves. So to become a member, you could buy a plot of land from the Charleston Land Company and build your residence there. And there were also, some of the land was actually plotted as farm lots. The farm lots were used for just what it says, farming, and the Charleston Land Company was trying to establish a self-sufficient community. They would take care of everything. They would take care of sickness, they would take care of food, they tried to develop their own economy, and all the daily needs of living were met by the Charleston Land Company.
And that's where some of those burial societies were formed as well, because they included that for families. But it's just amazing to me that we're talking about 1868. That's 3 years. You know, it would take tremendous courage, I think, to embark upon this kind of venture in just 3 years.
Right. And the point that we really need to stress is you were a freed slave. You didn't have any possessions. You didn't have any income. The only education you had was from stories from one slave to another, from one generation to another. And that was even difficult because families were really broken up during the slave era. So you had to start, when people say start from nothing, you really started from nothing.
Right. Some people arrived on this land, our land, as a result of having sought their families. A lot of people try to figure out, well, what did an enslaved person care about? What did they do with the advent of freedom? One of the first things that the majority of them did was to try to find their families. There are numerous ads. We have a local person that has talked about some of the formerly enslaved people that we just didn't know about and how they were sold and they were transported to so many other places. So some of the people that wound up on this land returned to this land in search of families that they left here. And it took years, you know, they didn't catch the bus. They had to walk. Right. They walked from Virginia to South Carolina, and sometimes it took years.
Yeah, and as a side note, that's the story of my great-grandmother. She came from Virginia. She had to walk in. Okay, this is a photo of the historic marker that's along Mathis Ferry Road that, is that Mathis Ferry? Yeah, that talks about Scanlonville. It was placed by the town of Mount Pleasant, and it gives a brief history of Mr. Scanlon and the Charleston Land Company. And it just reinforces that Mr. Scanlon and the group of 100 black men paid $6,100 for the 600 acres. Okay. In 1870, 2 years after the land purchase, they hired a surveyor. This slide shows how the property was divided, and it shows the lots. The large lots that you see to the right, those are farm lots. And the smaller lots, which are 100 by 200, they are the residential lots. All of the streets, well, I should say all of the avenues extend east to west. and all of the streets extend north to south, but they were all numbered. Like you would have First Street, Second Street, Third Street, and when you got to the avenues, you had First Avenue, Second Avenue, running east to west. Now, move that up to today, and that causes some kind of confusion, because you will sometimes get somebody trying to find a person, and they'll have an address of Third Avenue, and it's really Third Street. Or they'll end up on Third Street, and they really were trying to find Third Avenue. But anyway, this is how it was drawn up. That is the actual map in 1870.
Question before you move. If we look at the layout of the streets and the avenues, we'll be talking about the graveyard a little later. So help us try to find where that is on what we're looking at now.
Okay, starting from the waterfront, which would be to your left, which would be the Wando River. You see Second Street is the first street that you see extending south to north. Next street is Third Street, and the next street is Fourth Street. The graveyard is on the north end of the survey, and it's between Third and Fourth Street. So it would be the upper portion, that little area between Third and Fourth Street that's up to the north. That is the cemetery, which was shown in the 1870 plat. Now that'll become more significant as we move on, because there'll be some reference made to the cemetery.
For the engineering challenged, if we look at the E in the word Scanlonville, and we come straight down, that large portion, that's the graveyard?
That is the graveyard, that's correct.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, we can start that one.
Reconstruction followed the emancipation. And one of the things that's surprising about Reconstruction for a lot of people is that it only lasted 12 years. And sometimes arithmetically we know from the dates it was 12 years. But for most Americans, when you think back and you think about it, you know, after you leave it in 8th grade history, for some reason, it feels like it was a much bigger time. It was a much bigger deal. But it was only 12 years. And we'll talk about what happened after Reconstruction. But you're seeing a return to a greater and wider study of Reconstruction, because a lot happened there. Reconstruction it followed the war. Actually, when the troops left, the troops were federal troops were in place for most of that 12 years. And as the federal troops began to leave, some of the former owners tried to return to their old ways. Really severe problems occurred once that land was returned to those states that had seceded. And some of the impacts were felt, certainly in these 4 areas and others: the economic equity, self-governance, limitations on assimilation or social interactions, and certainly education was not available to all. And these were some of the things that were addressed during Reconstruction, but lost in that 13th year and later.
Again, this, I know it's impossible to read, but we were trying to give you an idea of where we were in 1930. This is just a partial list of the deeded property and property owners as of 1930. Again, another slide, and that is not all of it. So as you'll see in this slide, what we attempted to do was take those lists and highlight all the properties on the 1870 map that were deeded as of 1930.
It's a little difficult to look at that map, certainly when you think in terms of where the descendants of those people are now. One of the things that happened after Reconstruction was the onset of Jim Crow. And we'll talk a little about Jim Crow. But many people in America like to think of those Jim Crow laws and that period of time as a period of unfreedom or de-freedom. It's almost like Slavery 102. As you see here, in the post-Reconstruction era, it was embraced by former owners, those people that came back. And what they were doing was attempting to restore a life as close to slavery as possible. Slavery is gone, but Jim Crow is here. And think about Jim Crow as unfreedom, and then you sort of imagine some of the things that were going on. And how did they get the name? Some people wonder, where the name came from. There was a minstrel by the name of Thomas Wright, and he had a show called the Jump Jim Crow Minstrel Show. And so the name was taken from the minstrel's show, but after a while, I think it was in 1904, people began to refer to some of the laws that almost indicated a return to slavery or the next best thing. They interpreted those laws as Jim Crow laws. The newspapers published those laws or highlighted those laws as Jim Crow laws. So that's where the name came from, and we continue to hear that even today. So what happened during Jim Crow? Well, during Jim Crow and beyond, we're talking through the 60s, you had 4,000 people lynched. 4,000, that's a lot of people. There was a point at which people held banners saying a man was lynched today. And they put the banner out every time it happened. But that's a lot of people, and some of that was done during the Jim Crow era. Sometimes lynchings were entertainment events where children were brought and what have you. So we went awry a little bit there. The main thing that happened was more family separation. The great migration that you hear about where African Americans left, a lot of people left Scanlonville. We know families, and those families seem to congregate in one different, one distant place. Some would be in Boston, or a whole family would go to Chicago. And sometimes you see that even now. So that was the migration and family separation, which severely hurt an area that thrives on kinship network. Questionable imagery. The questionable imagery are the little watermelon-eating guys or gals. Some of the degrading images that lasted so very long. There were attempts to promote these images so that when you think about people of color, that's what came to your mind. And it did influence what the nation thought we could do or what the nation expected. Same thing in Scanlonville. Some of the others we can talk about later: unanticipated consequences, sharecropping, and you can find out additional information about these things. Certainly there are numerous stories directly related to some of these that we've heard in Scanlonville from our parents and grandparents. Restricted help from non-community residents. Now that's interesting because we've had some families move into Scanlonville, and they are very helpful. We have very supportive people of all colors. And we didn't always have that, but we've had that for a very long time. There's one family that comes to mind, and as long as I can remember, they've lived in Scanlonville. These were not people of color, but they've been helpful, but there have been times where their efforts to help were restricted. And some of that was social, it just wasn't really popular, and some of that probably was a little more heavy-handed. Backlash. We know a story about a fellow that just ran into some good luck. He bought a car, he drove to work in the car, and the gentleman that he worked for said, "You will not work for me and have a car better than mine, you're fired." So he was successful, and the backlash wasn't something that he was prepared for. His self-sufficiency was interrupted. Gerrymandering. Now, I don't know that that has happened a lot in Scanlonville, but in terms of the voting, now, segmenting of areas has caused us some other problems, but gerrymandering is just almost like the first cousin of redlining because it dictates where you can go, where you can live. Voter suppression, that occurred everywhere. That occurred everywhere. We had some numbers on the amount of voter participation for the last 50 years and the amount of voter participation after the Voting Rights Act was amazing. I mean, it went something like less than 10% to close to 50% just with the passage of the Voter Rights Act. Some of the ways voter suppression was applied, and you probably heard of literacy tests. I want to ask my friend here, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? Wrong. Poll taxes. You go to register and you find that there's a tax. Fees and fines and added payments, those are some of the ways that Jim Crow survives. There's always, you have to refer to insufficient education. My dad is a resident of Scanlonville. He went to Buse School in 1926, the same Buse School. And he talked about having books with no covers, used books. We do a lot better now. We do a lot better job. But back in those days, the residents of Scanlonville had to contend with some of these things, and they survived.
Right. And keep in mind that a lot of folks couldn't make it to downtown. Mm-hmm. So Scanlonville formed its own school, mm-hmm. Which was right off of Fifth Avenue.
That's right.
Yeah. A one-room schoolhouse. And many of the residents, the kids of Scanlonville, actually attended that school until Lang was built. Mm-hmm. And when Lang was built, it was amazing to me, because I went to school downtown, but a lot of folks walked from Scanlonville to Lang and Mount Pleasant. So there was insufficient education. Doctors, they were limited to. Medical healthcare was somewhat segregated, so we had to contend with that. Luckily, we had some folks in the neighborhood that could take care of your health needs.
Education was always important in Scanlonville. Like you say, we had our own school. We had play areas, we had other things that I'm sure you'll discuss, but we had our own school. And so education was extremely stressed. It was well stressed to everyone. Someone would come along and ask you, how are your grades? Or let me give you $5 for that A, or the number of A's you get on your report card. As I grew up, I just remember that everybody you meet that was an adult had some reference to how important education was for children.
Okay, this we get into the economy within Scanlonville. And this touches on the New Deal, HOLAC, housing,
Ownership, home ownership.
Home ownership, yeah.
Loan
Corporation, FHA, and Section 235 program. All of these had an effect on how Scanlonville developed. And I say that because those are programs I think developed under the New Deal, but full access to those programs wasn't afforded to certain communities. And that formal separation or denial of access is called redlining. And basically what redlining was, it was a government backed designation for areas of where you could provide loans to. Now, a lot of folks think that redlining only pertained to mortgages, but it pertained to loans, period. If your address showed up in certain areas, then you were more than likely denied a loan. So there was no income, no investment coming into that community. Want to follow up, Paul?
Well, the maps were required in every metropolitan area in the United States. It wasn't just one place. It just didn't happen over there or here, not even limited to Scanlonville. It was everywhere. And appraisers and assessors had to rely on those maps. And the green-coded areas indicated they were well-qualified borrowers. If the area was coded, inlined in red, then that suggested that these would be risky borrowers and therefore should not be afforded these loans.
Okay, and what we're trying to show here is typical housing under the Jim Crow era. And of the 4 pictures we have up there, 3 of the houses still exist, and 2 of them are still occupied. What's important about these photos are the materials in the houses are usually repurposed materials. In other words, a person would go to a demolition site, frequently like a building that was being demolished downtown, and they would collect the old materials from the demolition of a building. I can remember very vividly being a kid, and you would be hired to clean brick. So that was a typical summer job for us. You would get 2 cents or 1 cent per brick to clean all the mortar off of it. And what would happen, that would be used for new houses in the neighborhood. And that was a result of you could not get a loan, so you had to get building materials from somewhere, and that was the source of a lot of our building materials. Of course, wood you could collect, and that all you had to do was pull nails out. That was another occupation of the kids in the neighborhood. And the interesting thing was that a lot of the men would get together in the neighborhood and build a house for somebody. Then they'd move to the next house. If you were a painter, more than likely, you painted a lot of houses in the neighborhood. If you were a brick mason, well, more than likely, most of the houses in the neighborhood that had some masonry materials, one or 2 guys did it. So that was typical of the Jim Crow era before the loans were available to all. And again, we see some more houses from the Jim Crow era, in which those 2 are still there. Okay. Now we move into post-Jim Crow era, when we get into the Fair Housing Act of 1968. You can see a definite change in the way the houses look now, because you were able to get a loan, go through a normal contractor, and build yourself what is a fairly normal house. Now, back in the Jim Crow era, there were some folks that were a little better off because of their occupation, and they were able to build a house like this. But if you pull an aerial photo of the area back in the 60s, you would notice if someone had a really nice house, it was kind of built in the woods. It was hidden. And I got the opportunity to ask the local brick mason, who's passed on now, why would you build a house in the woods? As a young kid, I didn't understand. I said, why would you build a nice house like that in the woods? They said we had to keep it hidden, young man, because if we didn't, we might lose the house.
It could be burned.
Could be burned. This tries to show the number of business owners that actually lived in the neighborhood. The slide's a bit busy, but there were a number of entrepreneurs that supplied the needs of the neighborhood that actually lived in the neighborhood. The interesting thing about this slide, there's a gentleman called John Wrighton that lived on the corner of 4th Avenue and 6th Avenue. John Wrighton was actually the guy that sued the state of South Carolina for admission to University of South Carolina Law School. And South Carolina legislature responded with creating a law school at South Carolina State in Orangeburg. So all of the attorneys, I'll go as far as saying all of the attorneys in South Carolina owe a little bit of gratitude to Mr. John Wrighton. And he was a resident of Scanlonville.
He had many children, I remember.
Many children.
yeah, 6, 7 maybe.
Yeah. Scanlonville actually had its own many night spots. Riverside Beach, which a lot of folks know about. We had James Brown, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, all those type folks performed there.
James Brown was in residence for a while. You know, he came and stayed, for weeks on end and performed. They would perform at night, and one thing that was fun for the children is that they would rehearse during the day.
Right.
And so the children would be allowed at the rehearsal. They would be on good behavior. And as a kid, I remember seeing James Brown many, many days right down there, but not at night.
And he was a baseball fan because he would play pickup games before the show with the kids.
Where?
At White's Paradise.
And where did he play baseball?
The parking lot in front of White's Paradise.
Okay.
Yeah.
We did have a ball field. We had a recreation area in Scanlonville too.
Yeah.
Another thing about the businesses, some of these are suppliers, and we just wanted to show the array of business owners, the creativity from 1868 until now. I don't know what people envisioned when they thought about what kind of work we did or how we sustained ourselves, but it was pretty amazing to go back and try to identify the kinds of work that people did in a limited environment. The auto mechanics, we had shoe repair shops here in Charleston, and a lot of those people lived over here. A multitude of businesses, so much so that we even had in Scanlonville an elephant handler. The elephant handler lived in Scanlonville. This was, you can see the elephant over to your right. That's Susie Q of Channel 2. That was the mascot for the TV station for a while. And sometimes she got off the chain and got away, and she came right down to Scanlonville. Where Mr. Bosey, I have not been able to find out his full name, but he was the handler, and he took care of that elephant for quite some time. We talked about the importance of education. On this wheel, we see some of the teachers that lived in Scanlonville. I'm not sure how it happened that teachers began to choose that community, but this is some of the teachers or coaches or counselors that lived in the immediate community. And I believe those people had an impact, great impact, on how the community responded. Kinship networking was alive and well. And when you walked up to one of these people, you stood tall, and when they asked you a question, you answered quickly, and you knew that there would be follow-up questions that you had to answer smartly. So they kept you on your best behavior. They encouraged you to go to school. They encouraged you to get advanced education, and I believe it impacted the community.
Yeah. And the daily impact was you came home, you had homework as a normal student would, but because of the times, your parents may have not been formally educated. So in case you had a math program, a problem to solve, you weren't able to look to your parents to help you with it, but they would say, oh, Miss Williams down the street is a math teacher. I'll call her, go down there. So we had math teachers, history teachers, coaches, everybody in the community, and they weren't responsible for just teaching during the day, their formal job. When they came home, they still had responsibility to the community.
They had to teach Scanlonville. I remember a lot of people coming to us. I didn't know whether it was a big deal or not, but in the 50s or so, we had Encyclopedia Britannica.
Oh, yeah, right.
And we finally threw them out. My brothers told me they had to go. So I finally got rid of them, but I kept, I think, like 2 volumes just to see how the information was arranged in print. I had forgotten that the encyclopedia had so many pictures, but people would come to study for the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I remember my mom saying many times, if there were a fire in this house, I'd get my children out and I would go back for my Encyclopedia Britannica.
Right. Yeah, and they were well aware of which families owned encyclopedias because the entire neighborhood
Went
used
to
your
study.
encyclopedia.
And magazines, you know, if you had an assignment, you had to cut out articles, we shared. You know, I remember if you were trying to better yourself in a sport, the coaches, in addition to working with the neighbors, would help a child that was maybe less gifted.
Okay. These articles touch briefly on the battle with the cemetery. The cemetery that we showed you, we pointed out in an earlier slide on the north side of Remley's Point. Some years ago, a individual saw the cemetery and thought it was abandoned. As it turns out, he was unaware of African American burial traditions. So he bought the cemetery, and I say bought questionably. But the members of Remley's Point had to actually go back and sue to get the cemetery back. So this article just shows you what happened when we won the cemetery battle, which was it took years to get it back. And now I'm happy to say that the community actually owns the cemetery. Okay. And this was the headline of the day. And it brought great joy to all the members of the community when we won the cemetery back. You can actually see Mr. Fordham, your father, that was instrumental in that battle also.
The appearance at court was something that I would always remember. It was like the scene from To Kill a Mockingbird. There were so many people in the courtroom that day. There were young people, older people, all gathered together. It was just amazing that the community would rally like that. But in so doing, they helped us to win the lawsuit, which is pretty rare. I mean, hardly ever when one of the communities of color tries to fight for land from that they've owned for a long time, hardly ever does that community win. And we won, and the community was blessed, and they blessed us. They embraced each other because it was a good day. It was a great day.
Yeah, and when I talk about African American burial traditions, I'll just touch on that briefly. if you were to view the cemetery, you would not see an abundance of headstones. Well, if you've got graves from 1870 moving forward, many folks didn't have the means to buy a headstone. So they relied on traditional African markers. You will see a lot of evergreens, palm trees that look a little out of place if you pay attention to it. You will see cups and saucers, which would look like it's littered, but it's actually a grave marker. The idea being that as you travel to the other side, you will need all the things that you needed when you were walking this earth. So you'll see a person's favorite cup, you'll see broken plates, their plates, forks, and knives. On one grave marker, we actually have the guy's hat, and he was you always saw him with a can of beer. There's a can of beer still sitting on his grave to this day.
And if somebody moves it, somebody else will replace it.
Replaces it.
Yeah.
So seeing that, the guy didn't really understand the number of graves in there. He thought it was maybe 30, 40 graves, but it actually turned out there were well over 1,000 graves in that cemetery. And this is just a gathering, a community gathering for one of the longtime residents at the cemetery.
And this was after we won.
After we won the court case.
This was our first burial, but and I was surprised, that so many people came out to support and encourage us in the Civic Club. They were saying, we're burying again, we're burying again. And it meant a lot to a lot of people. Whenever we have a funeral, it's interesting to see the community members walk to find their own relatives.
Right. Right. And just a few of the markers that we do have back there. Okay, this brings us to the end of the presentation, and this is closing remarks. This short presentation attempts to provide a brief overview of the unique development of an American community named Scanlonville. The events are an account of a people's progression from slavery to self-reliance while retaining African-based cultural values. Our hope is that this event presented will compel others to question the events, their details, and their inconsistencies. The answers will require enormous effort and persistence in the pursuit of correctness and justice. We welcome all comments, questions, clarifications, and contributions that provide more clarity and a quest for understanding. And our email address is available there. We're happy to address any questions at any time.
We would like to give special thanks to the Chikora Foundation and Dr. Michael Trinkley. They provided support, encouragement, and certainly much needed research when we were fighting the battle to regain the cemetery. And we can never, ever thank them enough. They really helped us with that, and we want them to know we appreciate it every day. They produce a massive report for us, and if you're interested in researching more about the community and about the land, you can request that report, the Scanlonville report. You can request it from them at their website, which is shown here. It's been invaluable, much help to the Gullah Geechee people and the people of Scanlonville. We thank you.